Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We start with tensions between Turkey and the United States. The Trump administration ramped up pressure on Turkey with higher tariffs on steel imports, putting unprecedented sanctions on a NATO ally. Turkey says the U.S. policy would harm ties and vowed retaliation.
Rising tensions between Ankara and Washington. Last week, U.S. President Donald Trump doubled tariffs on Turkish steel and aluminum, sending the Turkish lira into a freefall. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan rallied Turks to defend their nation's economy, saying it's their patriotic duty to buy the lira.
If there is anyone who has dollars, euros, or gold under their pillows, they should go exchange it for liras at our banks. This is a national, domestic battle. This will be my people's response to those who have waged an economic war against us.
Speaking to members of his party, Mr. Erdogan said he'll start looking for new markets and new allies if the U.S. squanders its goodwill with Turkey. The Turkish government has already announced measures in the pipeline in case the Turkish economy takes a turn for the worse.
We are preparing to trade through national currencies with the countries we have the biggest trade volume with, such as China, Russia, Iran, and Ukraine. If European countries want to be liberated from the pressure of the dollar, we are ready to establish a similar system with them. By implementing this method and enabling other alternatives, we are determined to salvage our country from currency operations mid-term.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is due for a visit to Turkey on Monday for 2 days of talks as the row between Ankara and Washington worsens. Bilateral economic issues are at the top of the agenda. Turkey's row with the U.S. has further weighed on the lira. The two NATO allies have been at odds over a wide range of issues: diverging interests in Syria, Ankara's ambition to buy Russian defense systems, and more recently, the case of Andrew Brunson, an evangelical pastor on trial in Turkey. Last week, a Turkish delegation went to Washington and met U.S. counterparts, but there was no breakthrough.
So where is Turkish economy going and what is the impact on all of us, and what about the geopolitical ties between the United States and Turkey? To answer all of those questions, I'm joined by a very strong panel. With us in Beijing, we have John Gong, who is a professor from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, sir. And also in London, we have Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Darendorf Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome as well, sir. In Washington, D.C., we are joined by Bülent Alireza, Director and Senior Associate of the Turkey Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's originally coming from Turkey. Welcome to the three of you. Let me start by asking you, Dr. Alireza, what about the Turkish economy right now? The lira, where is it going? Is this an economic warfare coming from Washington against Turkey?
No, really, it's two questions in one that you posed to me. One is with respect to the Turkish economy, and the second is the economic warfare that President Erdogan is alleging that President Trump is waging on Turkey. And frankly, the two are getting intermingled with each other. Yes, the Turkish economy is going through a difficult time. That's because of the global conditions to a great extent, because the amount of funds available for emerging markets is slowing down. The Fed is increasing its interest rate, but also because there are concerns about whether Turkey's high growth strategy based on public spending and consumer spending is sustainable. Add on top of that the attitude of the Trump administration, which has picked up on the Brunson issue, but also has been unhappy for a number of reasons with Turkey. And as a result of that, the Turkish lira has been slipping. It's almost at 7 to the dollar, which is almost unthinkable. And back in April, it was 4 to the dollar. It's almost doubled since then. And in between, President Erdogan has won re-election, but the stability that's required has not come.
All right. What about for you, Professor Begg? We understand the European markets has been going plunge, especially some of the economies in European continent. What do you make of the impact of the lira right now plunging against the U.S. dollar, and what might be the impact on the European economy? Do you see it now?
Well, there are two answers to that question. One is that for the European economy as a whole, Turkey is pretty marginal. It's not a huge export market. It isn't a major source of foreign investment. Where it may have some impact is through European banks which have loaned money to Turkey and will see that money more at risk than it was in the past. The other answer is more a global one, that any kind of instability in the world system does risk having a contagion effect, a domino effect. And if there are problems in Turkey and they spread to other emerging markets, and other emerging markets spread to the more developed country markets, you can very easily see the kind of contagion that we want to avoid just coming out of so many years of difficult circumstances. So it's one of these yes and no answers to your question.
Yeah. Professor Gong from China, you're from emerging economy, developing countries. What about that? You see in the stock market, India, South Africa, and some of the other developing emerging economies all suffered on its global market so far when it comes to its currency. What does it mean to these economies?
Well, I think in general, dollar is getting stronger because of the interest rate rises in the U.S. But the Turkish issue, I think I'm a little bit concerned about the prospect of some Turkish companies defaulting on their loans. Some of them have already come out and said that there's no way they can repay these loans at such currency exchange ratio. The European holdings of the Turkish debt is actually quite sizable. I mean, we're talking about 60% to 70% of the total Turkish GDP that is, in debt to many European banks. And if these companies start to default on these loans, I'm not sure whether this cause a ripple effect on the European banking system. I mean, that's I think from a European perspective, that is the greatest danger. And if that happens, certainly it will fester into the rest of the world.
Right. Professor Beck, therefore, what do you think is the biggest issue here? Is it the domestic economic situation of Turkey and the way its economy has been developing, or it is about President Trump and his administration trying to start some kinds of what the Turkish side say economic war against Turkey, namely to double the steel the tariffs on the steel import to the United States, which is quite a big proportion when it comes to Turkish trade with other countries, and also to move on the political front as well. Professor Beck.
Well, let me start with the economic front. You know me, I do my homework, and I checked the figures for Turkey's exports. And in 2016, which is the last year for which there are comprehensive country-by-country data, Turkey's exports to the United States were just 5% of its total. So it's arithmetically not that significant that a change in the trade regime vis-a-vis the United States will happen. To put that in perspective, Turkey exports twice as much to Spain, to the UK, and even more to Italy, and just about the same amount to Iraq as it does to the United States. So the logic that says Trump's tariffs and an economic war with the United States are the thing dragging down the Turkish economy is a bit exaggerated. Indeed, if you add up what Turkey exports to Greece, to Romania and Bulgaria, its three closest neighbours, it's more or less the same as what they export to the United States.
Okay, but Turkish president argued the other way around. Erdogan recently said he blamed the United States as the reason for plummeting lira. He said that Turkey has uncovered a U.S. plot for the currency plunge, and the country is challenging it. Well, that's what he said recently.
Well,
so, Dr. Ali Reza, go ahead, Professor Beck.
Try to answer the political dimension to it. Yes, it's very helpful to Erdogan to try to blame somebody else, but it's domestic difficulties in the Turkish economy that I think are more fundamentally behind what's happening, and I think that's what Dr. Ali Reza was saying.
Dr. Ali Reza, of course, the Turkish economy is vulnerable at the moment, but Dr. Ali Reza, will that be a double pressure or even 3 times pressure if the United States put on further tariffs to hurt the confidence of investors in Turkey, as well as if the political relationship between these two countries used to be, in a way, alliance, but now going to the edge of that alliance, almost off the cliff. So what does that mean for Turkey eventually, before we move on to the bilateral relations?
I mean, we're talking about the increase in the tariffs, but let us remember that Trump had actually taken the unprecedented step of sanctioning two Turkish ministers because of the Brunson case. Right. So we have to put it into the political context. And the relationship with the United States is obviously the most important relationship that Turkey has. It has been an ally of the United States, not just since 1952 when it entered NATO, but all the way back to the Truman Doctrine. And the negative attitude on the part of the U.S. always has a major psychological impact beyond any other impact that it may have. And clearly Erdogan had hopes of a better relationship with Trump than he did with Obama in the latter days of Obama. That clearly is not happening. And that is changing the attitude, the psychological attitude with respect to Turkey and its ability to deal with its economic problems. And let us remember that economic confidence is to a great extent a product of confidence that the people within the country as well as the investors from outside have, and by that reckoning Turkey is in some degree of difficulty.
So Professor Beck, I think it's a legitimate question now to ask that is the United States now trying to use the method of, in a way, manipulate the confidence that other countries could have about the economy and indirectly try to influence the direction of that economy, as the U.S. could have the power so far? For example, in this case of Turkey.
Well, I think it's more the White House than it is the American system as a whole, because we have somebody who I think everybody agrees is quite erratic in the White House. He's confronted with an equally strong leader in Turkey who tends to be quite erratic himself. So their interplay is not working well. And I think that reinforces what's just been said by Dr. Ali Rizzo, that the political dimension of this is the most significant one. I don't think it's fair to say that there is a conspiracy on the part of the United States to diminish the Turkish economy. That's the rhetoric that a populist like Erdogan is going to deploy to answer his critics. What he should be concentrating on are his problems at home.
The problems at home for Turkey, but what about for the United States and Turkey? Is this something personal? I mean, Dr. Ali Reza, you saw these two leaders coming from the United States and Turkey actually quite appreciative of one another and their styles earlier, and now it seems to be it's a very different direction. The strongman politics that it both seem to embrace, or at least aspire to, seem to not necessarily bring them together, but rather bring them apart now.
Well, you know, just 1 month ago at the NATO summit, they were fist-bumping each other, and President Trump was complimenting Erdogan on being a strong leader. Yeah, clearly, you know, Trump is an erratic leader, as has just been said. And on the other hand, President Erdogan is a very prickly, very proud leader, and you know, put the two of them together, we have a crisis. Now, the American system does involve other parts. For example, Secretary Mattis is talking about how the defense relationship is still strong, but ultimately, the President of the United States does put his stamp on the relationship, and that's what Erdogan is reacting to, and personalizing the issue in the way that he has done over the past few days, frankly, will add fuel to the fire, because Trump will inevitably respond, and there will be escalation.
Professor Gong, though, I mean, besides this, the personal relationship, there something more than that. Of course, earlier we talked about the arrest of the pastor, and also the sanctions going on, as well as Turkey is now apparently moving toward buying missiles from Russia. Turkey is talking about, as a result of the latest dispute with the United States, moving away from the U.S., moving away from the Europeans, further toward Russia and some of the other countries. We understand the Iraqi minister Prime Minister is going to visit Turkey and Iran very soon. So how should we piece all of this information together? How much will it have an impact on the real nature of this relation, U.S. and Turkey?
Well, I think overall, I think the U.S. and Turkish interests should be aligned together with each other, sort of on a more of a long-term basis. I mean, although there are some divergence of interest, for example, in Syria, it's very clear that American support of the Turks is fundamentally at odds with Turkish interests. However, I think it has a lot to do. I think I really buy into the theory there is this, personal clashing among these two alpha males. I mean, I would add also a further support to this. Actually, it was an article published yesterday in New York Times saying that it's actually very close to a deal made in Washington, but for some reason it fell apart because the U.S. side issued an ultimatum by Wednesday this week, and later we see that Erdogan published an article in New York Times saying that Turkey is not a country being dealt with this way. I mean, Donald Trump totally misunderstands Turkish people. It doesn't work. Threat doesn't work with that nation. So I think there is some elements of truth in the fact that the two people, these two people are sort of dealing with each other sort of in a very personal manner, and no one is going to back out from this situation.
Obviously, President Erdogan's choice of using New York Times as the place to put in his editorial is quite a decision. As we all know, the relationship between Donald Trump and the New York Times. Dr. Ali Reza, what about that negotiation that has been, pretty much on the second line of evidence when we talk about the U.S.-Turkish relationship right now? What's going on there?
Well, by the time that the Turkish delegation came to Washington last week, the deal had collapsed. Apparently there was a deal in the aftermath of the meetings on the sidelines of the NATO summit between Erdogan and Trump, but somehow it broke down. My understanding is that the expectations on both sides were higher than what the other side was willing to satisfy. And when the Turkish delegation came to Washington, they were shocked because, as your guest from Beijing noted, the American line was quite harsh. It's interesting to note that it was previously the U.S. Congress that was moving towards a hard line with Turkey, including, for example, banning the sale of the F-35s. Now we have the administration joining, and let me also note that the New York Times, which published President Erdogan's article, has also been very critical of Erdogan and his government. So, we're talking about an across-the-board negative attitude on the part of the United States. It's also bipartisan. The Democrats don't take a different line from that of the president. And given the position of the Turkish government, as someone who's followed U.S.-Turkish relations for 3 decades, I'm very pessimistic about what's going to happen next.
Dr. Alireza, you said so. I have to follow up a little bit. We have seen this pattern of politics or geopolitics from Washington now. Of course, what Trump administration really likes might exactly the opposite of what the Capitol Hill would really want. However, at times when Donald Trump is really getting hardline with certain countries, the Capitol Hill also applaud. So it seems that the general trend is the U.S. is not necessarily at this point warming up relations with many countries at all, but rather going the hard lines against as many countries as we know. So Dr. Ali Reza, do we see also through the Turkey story another indication of where U.S. geopolitics is going, and whether a so-called new Cold War line is being gradually drawn up and make into being? Dr. Ali Reza.
Well, the Cold War really pitted the Soviet Union, which is no more, against the United States. And there was an international order established after the Second World War, which lasted through the Cold War, in which the Western countries were lined up behind the United States. That included also the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. We're in a very, very different world now, in which Trump wants to get on with Russia and with Putin. The Congress is imposing sanctions on Russia. Trump is moving into a trade war with China, the most important trading partner of the United States. It is picking a fight with countries like Mexico and Canada and threatening to undo the NAFTA deal. And it's also picking up fights with allies like Turkey. Now, we're in a new phase in which the geopolitical direction of U.S. foreign policy is unclear. And I fear that for the rest of the Trump administration, we're going to be having this kind of discussion as to where U.S. foreign policy is going.
All right. Professor Begg, here is the issue here. Not only what is going on between Turkey and the United States, the impact if one economy as big, well, you could say middle-sized, as Turkey going into trouble. It's going to have a ripple effect on the European economy, those in the rest of the world as well. So far, already some suggesting some economies based on, working on its exchange rate with the United States and also working on a lot of building debts are running into similar trouble as the Turkish economy. Professor Begg, your thought here, what exactly are we seeing? Is this really the beginning of something? Should we be extremely concerned?
I think not. We again have to come back to my favorite topic, the size of things, the arithmetic of things. And although Turkey may be facing a downturn, it may face some difficulties because of the fallen exchange rate, don't forget that a lower exchange rate sometimes helps an economy by making it more competitive. And the scale of Turkey in relation to the European economy or the US economy is small enough for it not to be that significant if there's a minor downturn. Now, it's very different if there's a major recession or major crisis or it turns into something geopolitical. But just on the economics of this, I'd be very cautious about saying this is going to have significant ripple effects.
All right.
What it may do, though, is undermine confidence in the way it was discussed earlier.
Mr. Gong, Professor Gong, before we go, your thought as well, sir.
Yeah, I'm still a little bit concerned. I think that the numbers I have read is a little bit different. I mean, I see that the exports of steel to the United States accounts for about 10 to 17% of total exports. So it's actually not an insignificant number. And the doubling of tariffs is more than just adding insult to injury. It's almost adding injury to injury. The timing of this is, in my opinion, is quite opportune and strategic, just to make things very difficult for the Erdogan administration. So I think the Turkish economy is very likely to take a downturn, and I'm a little bit concerned that so far he hasn't really taken any actions. In situations like this, I think the first thing he should do is really to take measures to control capital outflow, just to make sure that there's no maximum amount of capital exodus. He's not doing that. So I'm very puzzled as to why he's not doing this. He's asking people to dig out dollars under their pillows and stuff like that. I mean, that's something I'm not sure people will just follow. I'm not very familiar with Turkish people, but it's quite difficult to persuade people that way.
All right. Well, I guess we're going to watch very closely as things evolve. But for now, thank you so much, the three of you, for being with us. John Gong, Ian Begg, and Bülent Ali Reza. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.